The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, back with another lecture covering the third movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. In the last lecture, we covered this beautiful introduction with duo, solo, English horn, and oboe, leading to the statement of the theme in flutes and violins, very much like the statement of the Idée fixe in the first movement. And then after that, we saw how Berlioz took that theme and created a beautiful variation on it. Now we're going into the second variation, and here we are really digging into the soul of this pastoral movement. And in fact, we're going to see more and more influences from Beethoven as we go by. We saw some before, especially in the second half of last lecture. Here we're going to see more and more as Berlioz really gets into the heart of his affection for Harriet. And I feel, as I mentioned before, that this is Berlioz at his most emotionally honest, really reaching out to Harriet and putting forth his case for their life together in the most artistically sincere way possible. At the very end of the last screen of last lecture, we saw how the strings were sort of working their way downwards in a very dedicated way, and yet with a bit of diminuendo. So everything ends up on these C's and E's in the lower strings, violas, and seconds. And right when it stops, this lovely little motive is introduced in the first violins. Ba-da-da-da-da-da. And it's answered by the first oboe. I feel this is very Beethoven-like. Ba-bum, da-da-da-da-da-da, ba-bum. And then the first violins answer da-dum, and the flutes answer ba-bum, same note as the oboes, and they just trade off back and forth. Now this motive becomes its own thing. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's almost minimalist, isn't it? This little repeated ostinato. Now if we were to go further and see what happens to it, it eventually becomes its own little background counter melody, playing while the theme returns in the lower strings. There isn't a huge amount to say about this particular counter melody because really the interest here is in how everything else is orchestrated around it, right? The little melody sort of wends its way through the music and doesn't ever necessarily have to worry about problems of balance because nothing really gets over a mezzo forte crescendo in the bass, which doesn't interfere with the violins, and nothing really gets over a pianissimo in the winds or piano pizzicato in the strings. So there is nothing standing in the way of the first violins just doing what they're doing, even marked triple P. Of course, it really is more just a little bit under poco piano, as Brahms might score it. So let's look at the construction of this page and not get too tied up in knots over this lovely little obbligato right in here. Starting with the scoring of the melody, we've got soli cellos and half of the divisi violas. This is the kind of thing where I would practically be tempted to ask the first members of each desk to play the melody and to have the second members play the pizzicato on this, because you would sort of expect the first members to have more leadership. but then that takes away the associate player's ability to shine. So it's probably better to leave it alone, but it's just tempting to give the melody to the most experienced players who might actually be the closest to the audience in this case, if the setup is violas to the right of the conductor. Here we see that theme coming back, pretty much the same as it was before, only down quite a bit and in C major. What's interesting here is that the bassoons are playing unison, and this time unison means A4, not A2. Once again, may I just remind everybody, because I don't know who is watching what lecture in what order, do not write unison when you mean A4 or A2 or A3 or whatever on your wind and brass parts. Just really don't do that. This is something that's in the Urtext edition, and it is the decision of the publisher to put it out like that, but don't you do it, all right? If you intend for 4 bassoons to be playing this melody all at the same time, write in A4. Do not write unison. Just looking at the register of this melody, it's beautifully placed in the lowest register of the violas, and this right here is perfectly negotiable as a double stop. You can reach that A on the G string and this F sharp on the C string. And in fact, I should think that it would be really fun to have the violas play this Sol C. They will be anyways for the first couple of bars, but when they reach up for this C right here, just to stay with that really intense sound. As for the cellos, it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't be marking Sol G on this to have the lowest possible string, or even Sol C, which would get very tricky when you got all the way up here to 2 octaves above the open string. So don't worry about it for the cellos, but possibly assign it for the violas. I'm actually noticing that some conductors are getting back to me and saying, hey, interesting suggestion there, or wow, I'm going through conducting class and I'm glad that I had a chance to look at this lecture first because we're studying this. So I am not a conductor, but I have the perspective of the orchestrator. So if that is valuable to you as a conductor and making your own decisions, that's great. And if somehow those decisions make it onto a recording, that is fantastic. Let me know. Send me a link and I'll have a listen to see how it all worked out. But you do what is important for you, okay? This is interesting right in here, A and F sharp. It actually would be just as easy for the cellos to be able to reach that same exact double stop there, but it makes sense for the violas to be doing it. And especially when you've got this same complementary pitch being played pizzicato. Speaking of pizzicato, let's check out our first accompaniment element. There are 2 things going on in the accompaniment. One is this lovely plucking, and it's almost like our little shepherd's band of players. Perhaps a shepherd has got a little stringed instrument, and they're playing this on guitar or whatever else they might have available, lute, mandolin, mandocello, since this is reaching so low. So we've got this plucking here, and then this 16th is so beautifully authentic. Da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da. And it really gives the feeling of a folk accompaniment there in the strings. Now, that is being contrasted in the middle of each bar by bump-ba-bump. So you could think of this as bird calls, right? And a lot of people interpret it as that. So you've got this lovely stack of Gs, first flute on the high G, first oboe and first clarinet on the low G, sounding G, written A, right? And then G an octave below that being played by your second clarinet. And here we've got our E flat horn, and that is playing the same pitch as the second clarinet. Remember, down a major 6th, which would give us a G. Now, as far as the scoring is concerned, it's just the same thing over and over and over again. G, 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 and so on and so on and so on. but the harmony changes in context with our little imaginary mandocello player, or whatever that is supposed to be, guitarist. And you can see on this screen that the same essential thing is going on for another 5 bars. G, 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 G. No change whatsoever. In terms of the accompaniment here, this plucking, pluck, 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 it really maintains that same level. And notice the basses are up, right? That also helps with the, not illusion, but evocation of somebody playing on a guitar or on a mandola or whatever, some mid-range fretted instrument. And meanwhile, our little melody goes beautifully onwards. I feel that the addition of the violas here not only smooths out the sound of the cellos, but it also helps to absorb any possible stridency that might be coming from the bassoons. Remember that this is A4 bassoons. Now, here's an interesting thing, and that is usually you keep A2 bassoons, A3 bassoons, below A. I would say don't go above A if the part is exposed. And I've actually taken A2 bassoons all the way up to D above middle C in my harp concerto, but they were doubled by cellos. And here, Berlioz is doing the same thing. He's going higher and higher, but A4, right? A4 on the bassoons. And I feel that that is all the stronger the argument for putting in the violas right in here to absorb some of the sound of the bassoons. The result is that combining the bassoons with the cellos and violas like this is a beautifully rich sound. Just wonderful. And I think that it is something that could easily be quoted in today's epic scoring. Just adding maybe half the violas, not all the violas, that's a really thick sound, but half the violas to the cellos and then throwing in your bassoons. And not worrying too much about going higher than A or middle C in your A2 scoring. A4 if you've got the bassoons, but A2 scoring. Meanwhile, our violins are just merrily going along on this beautiful, unfolding little obbligato, going all the way up to the same G as the flute, right on the same note. And it does it again. So lovely. And then here it changes to triplets and crescendo molto for the violins, but not for anybody else, really. Then suddenly, we've got this forte here. Notice that the second violins are coming in and basically supporting this obbligato here in the violins, or at least the wrapping up of that obbligato. And they are both marked forte. That's where Berlioz wants the strength. Returning to arco for the instruments that were pizzicato before, and just really digging into it. Just for this big moment of doubt, of anxiety. Here is Berlioz feeling his theme, the theme of the countryside, and the little peeps by the birdies in the trees, and the little plucking of that mysterious instrument. Let's call it a mandocello, because I'm a mandocello player. The strumming of the mandocello, and that theme in his heart. And then he gets this moment of anxiety. What if she's hanging out with somebody else? What am I going to do then? Sudden sense of loss, and maybe just a flame of jealousy. And a very, very cool chord in here, of course. A's in the bass, not too low. And A octaves in the F horns. So that's our kind of foundation. A's in the violas. Notice that there is a triple stop right in here. And this is really easy to play because you're just playing a C third on the second and third string and then adding the open A above. So these are obviously intended to be open A strings. Those are our big stacked A's. Then we've got an E as well, right in there with our C horn. Then this written B flat in the E flat horn is down a major sixth. So that gives us a D flat, in this case C sharp, the same C sharp we're seeing right in here. Where Berlioz gets the tension is going from the D to the C sharp and then just hanging on that and changing it into a diminished chord with the addition of the B flat in the violas. And speaking of things sort of floating along, here we're seeing yet another technique being used very casually by Berlioz, and that is slurred staccato. It's kind of like a light portato. So the middle strings, violas and cellos, are going to appear to be floating along right in here. And here we've got non-divisi stacked octaves in the firsts and seconds. Berlioz keeps it pretty easy on the players by not necessarily having them play melodically, but just take over the role of playing these high Gs, the same pitches that were used before by our winds and horns. Right? We've got that same G happening, which is going to change, descend to F and E flat and so on. But what's cool here is that it really is setting things up the same way that the strings set up the response from the winds in the previous lecture. G ba da 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 da, G ba da 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 da. This continuing floating is going to go along here. Notice that Berlioz uses the little bracket to indicate non-divisi. That's just one particular way of writing it. Now at this point, Berlioz has got to build up some energy, leading to a big burst of emotion. And I could have put that all on one screen, but I'm going to save it for the next screen and the next half of this lecture. So let's just look at the build-up, and then we'll look at the payoff in a few minutes. So the build-up, pretty simple. We are going from this floaty kind of idea here to measured tremolo, and I feel here, even though it's very, very fast, it really is intended to be a measured tremolo. That way it can underline this dotted rhythm right in here, which is certainly easy to play at the really slow tempo that Berlioz has indicated at the beginning of the movement. So we've got this harmony right in here, very simple C octaves with F octaves in the bass. The double bass is not playing the measured tremolo, just basically tracking the cellos from below by an octave. And over that, Berlioz is putting this little A flat to D, A flat to D, G, D, and so on. Now here is where the phenomenon of the violins played loudly enough, swallowing the flutes an octave above. And it's made all the more complex and emphatic by the fact that the first clarinet is doubling the first violins as well. So you've got that added weight of tone. So that will tend to absorb the flutes in certain recordings, certainly in the recording that I'm going to be using. So Berlioz would have totally been aware of that. This isn't just a phenomenon that arose and is sort of random depending on how the flute player plays it. It really is a kind of brightening from above of a line being played by the violins. So keep that in mind. There is a tip in 100 More Orchestration Tips about that. Something to look out for. And then this big push here by horn, winds, and especially strings. These Cs, basically an octave C, middle C sounding the next C above sounding, and then of course this written C here sounding as it's supposed to be, all pushing towards the next bar as this really goes nuts right in here. These da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Kind of a simple idea, but still played with a lot of gusto. It really sets up the next bar in a really great way. So remember all of this. And then, of course, you're going to hear it, and then we're going to look at that next bar immediately. So think about all those things. Think about how the doubling here of the clarinets makes the violins all the more intense and all the more capable of absorbing a single flute above, just as we've seen in Mozart and Beethoven, in other examples that I've talked about over the years. And, of course, the way these octave violins set up these lovely cascading notes here in the upper winds, which when you look at the scoring really is just octaves in the first clarinet and flute, with the oboe doubling what notes are more feasible in the clarinet, letting off before getting to the C sharp. The very simple and effective construction here. The little peeping of the birds, the strumming of the mandocello, the obbligato violins, and that rich, rich melody of half the violas helping out the cellos as they double the bassoons. And of course, this wonderful moment of stress. Here's another bar that I strongly recommend you take apart yourself if you're really curious about the harmony. I could have gone on a little bit further about it, especially right here on this last little beat in the first half of the bar, but there just kind of isn't time. And then right at the beginning, you'll hear the da-da-da-da-da-da, ba-bum, da-da-da-da-da-da, ba-bum. One last little thing. Berlioz was anticipating that people would start to rush things right in here. So he says, hey, don't rush, or don't speed up right in here. Just keep everything really measured. And that sets this up beautifully and elegantly, very much in the manner of one of Beethoven's pastorals, especially the adagio from his own pastoral symphony. Listen for all those things, and then prepare yourself for the return of the E-Day fix. And now for the E-Day fix. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about this bar right in here, which is one of my favorite bars in the entire movement. And it just is this mighty, triumphant burst of hope. I feel that it is Berlioz saying that my mood is lifted by the thought that I have found Harriet. Something that he can really feel good about. Yes, his passion for her has triggered all these neuroses and anxieties and so on. But at the same time, it is a comfort to him. It is a positive thing that he has got this passion. It's very simply scored when you think about it. Don't be distracted by these 30-second notes on the first beat here in the strings. Just cut them in half, and then you see that they follow along with the other elements that are happening in the music. Looking at things from the bottom up, we're starting with cellos and double basses in octaves, right in here, ending on this B flat. And we've got the same pitches being covered by the second bassoon, starting on the lower B flat, doubling the double basses, and then jumping up to the cello line from the next note onwards, walking up to F. And then he throws in this extra little F B flat going on right in here, just so that he can end up on B flat from both directions, above and below. So that is our mighty bass line. And now, let's look at the melody. We've got this harmonized melody right in here, thirds going to a fifth, then back to thirds, and so on. And we're seeing the same notes as the first flute being doubled by first violins. And notice once again that Berlioz jumps down to an A, so that he can resolve both from above and then below on the same B flat. Meanwhile, the oboes are playing these B-flat octaves, changing to a fourth, then an augmented fourth, and then a sixth, all very typical common practice kind of resolution. So we've got our seconds doubling the first oboe and then changing to an octave here. And then sort of playing complementary pitches around there. We still have the B flat on top, right? But then there's an F in the middle here with the oboe and a D below by the second, so it just enriches the harmony right in there. Then E flat to D, same notes here as the second oboe. And then of course this A right here going up to a B flat is going to be doubled by the first violins. As for the violas, they've got the same F right in here as the bassoons, then leaping up here to some internal pitches right here. Then we got our D octave right in here, which has got the same root as this D right here and the bassoons, and so on, ending with these ferocious B-flat fifths, which we'll talk about in a minute, all of this tremolo. And meanwhile, we've got first horn and first bassoon doubling each other, working really, really well right in here. Very forceful right there in the middle. C horns sitting on that B-flat, which is extremely effective coming from the middle of the harmony. And then our E-flat horn basically doubling the F horn and the first bassoon on the first three notes, and then eventually rejoining the first horn on that sounding F. I took a little bit of time to unpack this for you, just because I feel that on such a terrifically positive burst of color and emotion, you should really have a little bit of help picking it apart. But try that with other big tutti chords that I don't have time to take apart in future bars, like figuring out who's playing the bass and where the melody is sitting and how the winds and the strings might be supporting each other, and then where are the horns in the middle of the sound picture, and so on. So we're ending here with a ferocious B-flat chord in tremolo, very tensely, right? This could also mean stringendo in terms of increasing speed, but that's not what Berlioz intends here. He just means increasing tension. So it just really should be ferocious here, like pushing it up to 64th notes is really on the very edge of what can be measured. I mentioned before that there were 64th note tremolos, quadruple beam tremolos, and it was really just on the edge for those double basses of what they could measure. So I feel that this is a technique that is new to symphonic scoring, and Berlioz is still working out whether or not it's measured or unmeasured. Today I would say it doesn't really need to be measured at all. But it's possible, just not very fun. And it's a very simple chord, isn't it? It's B-flat thirds. It's perfectly possible to play this non-divisi. You have your open D string, and you've got your B-flat below. Here, a little trickier, playing this as a D third on the third and fourth strings, but no big deal. And then a bigger B-flat fifth, really no big problem for those violas. And then going on, these are all very carefully worked out so that they can remain double stops and not have to go to divisi. Now, what happens after that? Well, do you remember that violin obbligato that was so prevalent that floated over the top of the beginning of this variation? Well, here we see a form of it returning, and I'm sure that you could go back to that obbligato and find certain melodic curves that are similar to what's going on in this statement right here. I'm sure that this is intended to recall that obbligato and to develop it. Once again, we've got the bassoons, unison, which actually means A4. A4 bassoons doubling cellos. No violas this time, and you notice that there really is a difference when you take out the violas. And then double basses an octave below. So it's very gruff and very intense. And it'll really have an edge to it as the bassoons and cellos go up into the tenor register together. Now notice, all the same, diminuendo poco a poco, so we end up with piano, and then just like a beautiful parting of the clouds and the sunlight comes through. Bum, bum, ba, da, da, da. Flute and oboe doubling each other. First at octaves, which beautifully inhabits this lower area right in here where the oboe plays at its most elegant. And then an octave higher where the flute is at its most expressive. And what is beautiful here is how this obbligato and these tremolos right in here just let go. And the idée fixe is played by first oboe and first flute over this simple B-flat third in the clarinets, changing to a fifth as the flute and oboe play this D, that lovely mediant of the B-flat major chord. So simple, so effective, so beautiful. And then as that first phrase finishes, the echo of the obbligato comes back in and continues on reacting to what happened. So I'm certain there are a bunch of ways that you could look at this programmatically. The kind of rough, jolly vibe of the countryside, that wonderful sense of rusticness, being contrasted with the wonderful elegance and exquisiteness of his memories of Harriet. Then bum 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 da 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 da, starting in F and then taking us back to B flat again. And then we have those same elements, the obbligato continuing on in A4 bassoons and cellos and double basses under the tremolo upper strings. And then here we've got that da 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 da. And as that gets going, something really beautiful happens here. We've got our jolly, lusty fellows down here with their counterpoint to Harriet. And then the counterpoint gets its own counter melody with the violins reacting to the lower strings. And this goes back and forth. It isn't really counterpoint per se. It's more like a trading off of melodic duties and contrast of registers. It's great that the violas jump in here to form a triple octave with our cellos and basses, and that's very, very effective because the violins don't really need any help from the violas in a fully stocked string section. This appears to be leading somewhere at the end of the screen, but what we see is that it just ends on this high A-flat octave played by oboe and flute, and then everybody in the strings plus bassoons joins in this wonderful development of the obbligato theme, just reaching higher every time, imitating, da 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 ba da 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 da, just really reaching higher and higher each time with that phrase, and then becoming ever more boisterous, sort of taking over the general melodic arc of the idée fixe as it's ended there. And then really going to town with it. I love these doubled notes right in here, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and so on. And then flutes come back in these octaves along with the violins, and they're incredibly effective. The strength of this up here, this F, 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 F sharp, as the rest of the strings wind up towards this moment right in here. Now, I was going to end the lecture here, but the next screen is just so compelling. Let's just add one more screen, and then our next lecture will be a little bit shorter than normal. We end up with this big blaze here. So the rustic countryside has taken over, and his passion has led him to doubt and anger. Is she with someone else? I'm jealous, I'm hurt, I need to be with her, I hate this separation from her, and everything else. And right in here, we have the Beethoven influence just bursting forth. This kind of scoring is very much Beethoven sounding. Now, why is that? Let's take it apart a little bit. And once you understand what's going on in the first bar, you can just apply that to the rest of it. And then we'll talk about what this means right in here. basses up, and so are the cellos on these B flats. And then we've got C sharp and G. So obviously Berlioz is setting up a diminished chord right here. We've got the C sharp and the E and the G octaves on top there. Lovely, evenly spaced pitches in the strings right in here. So that's really important for the Beethoven sound. And underpinning that, at the same exact pitch as the double basses, we've got these rolls right in here with the B flat timpani. So he says, use beaters made out of wood. So he just really wants powerful, direct sounding rolls right in here from both of his timpani players. So now let's look at how the other elements are added on. We've got our C sharp diminished fifth right in there, locking right into this G octave in the violins. We've got a G sixth being played here, same thing, the lower G and then filling in the E. So the winds are filling in the harmony on top while the violins just play an octave. Then right in here we've got our E third, which is playing the same G right here in the firsts and the same E right there in the seconds. Now there's no need for Berlioz to fill in every single pitch, as you might see in later Romantic scoring. So he just jumps down the sound picture to double the cellos and the lower note of the violas on his bassoons here, B flat and C sharp. Meanwhile, with the horns, we've got our F horns, A2, not unison, supplying the same G as the top note of the double stop violas. We've got the horns supplying an E that will be playing in between these two pitches. And that note will also be doubled by the cellos. Adding that all together, you get a very Beethoven-like chord. Now, I could just break all of that down by saying the first violins play octaves, the upper winds add a full-blown four-part harmony inside that octave, and then the middle strings are stretched out underneath that, going down to higher-placed cellos, and the clarinets get the top of that, and the bassoons get the bottom of that. Meanwhile, the horns fill in the middle, and then you've got your Beethoven sound. And I could probably find other examples of a similar approach to this in Beethoven's works, especially in the Ninth and the Fifth Symphonies. So Berlioz has his moment of passion here, and he amps it up, and then he lets go. He's just feeling so sorry for himself that he doesn't really have the energy to be mad. And he just has this one solo cello here, ending on this D flat. That's the most energy that he can muster there. And all that remains in this lecture to do is to note how flutes and oboes play this lovely little harmonized melody going all the way up to the top here. And when they reach this bar, the clarinets come in and double them from below. We got a little bit of bass down in here, F in the bassoons, changing to a B flat fifth, to a B flat octave, to C, and so on. And supported by pizzicato in the strings, except for these trills in the violins. It's really great how these trills in the violins are providing sort of the middle of the harmony right in here as this theme plays, and then they join together on this F. And then ending the trill on this C here, which once again supplies the middle note of the harmony right in here between the clarinets and the upper winds above. Really, really beautiful scoring, and very, very effective after all of this tragedy. Almost a bit of self-mockery right in here. Berlioz had a tendency to realize that he went too far a lot of the time, and he would be slightly ironic in some of his writing, especially if you check out the way that he depicts his youthful anxieties and angers and fits of temper, and then having to sort of take it all back or change his mind. He realizes that he goes too far a lot of the time, and I think that sometimes he builds that into the music. So massive fit of passion right in here, and then he just lets go of it. Ugh. Then he sets up the next variation, which we'll study in the next lecture. This is fun. This is actually the second lecture that I'm recording on the same day, and if I have time, I'll record the third one as well, because I love this movement so much, and it is, I feel, really the heart of this symphony, and so easy to ignore when people just want to move on to the big, bombastic fourth and fifth movements. But really, this is the sweet spot of this symphony. So check out that beautiful wind scoring right in here, with a little help from wind trills and pizzicato. And also, forgot to mention, this little middle C sitting right in here, which is doubled for half the bar by the first bassoon before it goes down to thicken the second bassoon's line, along with this lower pizzicato here in the lower strings. And then, of course, this kind of limping, chromatic, downwards motion right in here. So much fun. More chords for you to pick apart if you really want to see the individual construction, because Berlioz does change the voicing a bit right in here. So that's worth checking out if you are really into studying tutti harmony. Notice the power right in here of the wooden mallets, and then how that was all set up by the development of the string obbligato that just got more and more frantic. Then these heralding Fs, changing to an F sharp, and then just a big, massive chord paying off. And how this upward searching is really just evoking what happens next in the E-Day fix, which ends right here on this nice long A flat. Then speaking of that E-Day fix, the lovely way that we've got octaves, for the most part, in the oboes and flutes, but every once in a while they will join together. Like, for instance, right in here, at unison, and then jump to an octave again. And the simple accompaniment of the clarinets while that is going on. And then, of course, the reaction of the very rustic, very intense obbligato theme, countering it right in there, and even having its own counter melodies. And then this wonderful screen right in here, the big wrap-up of what was going on previously, and then the introduction of the E-Day fix by all of these other elements that we discussed before. And, of course, the lovely simple accompaniment of the clarinets right in here at this first statement of the E-Day fix. It's all just magical. So I hope you enjoy that. And the next lecture should be edited within a few days. I'm trying to get a lot of it out of the way now because I have to return to a big project that I was working on at the end of last year, and I really need to set aside a few weeks for that uninterrupted. So I'm doing a lot of stuff ahead of time, and wow, am I enjoying myself talking about and exploring this movement with you, because really it's one of those things that's so easy to just pass over and ignore and just say, oh yeah, that's the slow movement. Kind of boring. Let's just get that over with. And now we get to the fun part, the march. And then after that, the Witches' Sabbath. Woohoo! Okay, well, slow down, Mustang Sally. This is really, really the interesting part in terms of heartfelt emotions, simplicity of expression, and ingenuity of pastoral scoring. And of course, just his feeling for Harriet right in here that he cannot repress anymore, done in a way that is so tender and so convincing. So I hope you agree with that assessment. Enjoy listening to this, and I will see you soon for the third part of Movement 3.